Margaret Rose Williams had always believed that family came first. At 72, she still carried herself with the grace of the high school principal she'd been for 35 years. Her silver hair always perfectly styled, her posture straight, despite the arthritis that had begun to settle in her joints. The laugh lines around her warm brown eyes spoke of a life spent nurturing others. But lately, those eyes held a weariness that seemed to deepen with each passing day. For 4 decades, Margaret had shaped young minds at Lincoln High School, earning the respect of students, parents, and colleagues alike. She was known for her firm but fair approach, her ability to see potential in even the most troubled teenagers, and her unwavering belief that education could transform lives. But her greatest pride had always been her family, specifically her only son, David, whom she'd raised as a single mother after her husband died in a car accident when David was just 8 years old. Margaret had sacrificed everything for that boy. She'd worked double shifts tutoring students to pay for his college education, sold her beloved piano to fund his graduate school, and even took out a second mortgage on her home to help him start his accounting practice. When David married Jessica, 5 years ago, Margaret had welcomed her daughter-in-law with open arms, hoping to finally have the daughter she'd always dreamed of. But somewhere along the way, Margaret had become invisible in her own home. David and Jessica had moved in with her 2 years ago, claiming it was temporary while they saved for their own place. What was supposed to be 6 months had stretched into years, and Margaret found herself increasingly marginalized in the house she'd worked so hard to maintain. The woman who had once commanded respect from hundreds of students now felt like a stranger in her own living room. The turning point came on a cold Tuesday morning in November, when Jessica's shrill voice cut through the breakfast silence like a blade. "God, Margaret, you're such trash. No wonder nobody wants to be around you anymore." How had it come to this? How had the woman who'd given everything become nothing more than an inconvenience to be tolerated? Margaret's relationship with David had once been the cornerstone of her existence. After losing her husband James in that devastating accident, she'd poured every ounce of her love and energy into raising their son. She remembered the countless nights she'd stayed up helping him with homework, the weekends spent driving him to baseball games and music lessons, the way she'd worked extra jobs to ensure he never felt the absence of his father too keenly. Even as an adult, David had relied heavily on his mother's support. When he struggled to find clients for his new accounting practice, Margaret had used her extensive network of educator friends and community connections to help him build his business. She'd co-signed loans, provided financial backing, and even converted her home office into a workspace for him during his first year. When he needed a character reference for his CPA license, Margaret's reputation in the community had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Margaret had also been there for every milestone, helping him pick out Jessica's engagement ring, hosting their rehearsal dinner in her backyard garden, and taking out yet another loan to help pay for their honeymoon to Europe. She'd imagined that Jessica would bring new energy and joy to their small family, perhaps even give her the grandchildren she'd always hoped for. Initially, Jessica had seemed appreciative of Margaret's generosity. She'd praised the older woman's cooking, complimented her decorating skills, and even sought her advice on career matters. But as the months passed, Jessica's attitude began to shift. Small comments about Margaret's old-fashioned ways became more frequent. Eye rolls replaced smiles when Margaret shared stories from her teaching days. The gratitude transformed into entitled expectation. The change in David was perhaps even more painful to witness. The son who had once called his mother daily, who had sought her counsel on every major decision, gradually became distant and dismissive. When Margaret tried to address the shift in their relationship, David would brush off her concerns with phrases like, "Mom, you're being too sensitive," or "Jessica's just trying to help modernize things around here." Margaret began to realize that her decades of unconditional giving had somehow made her expendable in the eyes of those she loved most. The woman who had sacrificed her own dreams and desires for her family's success had become a burden they tolerated rather than a matriarch they honored. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday in Margaret's increasingly uncomfortable routine. She'd risen early, as was her habit from decades of school schedules, and prepared breakfast for David and Jessica before they left for work. The kitchen, once the heart of warm family gatherings, had become a tense space where conversations were stilted and gratitude was nowhere to be found. Margaret had set the table with her good china, the same delicate blue and white pattern she'd received as a wedding gift 47 years earlier. She'd prepared David's favorite blueberry pancakes, the same recipe she'd used since he was a child, and fresh coffee in the French press that Jessica preferred. Despite their coldness toward her, Margaret continued these small acts of love, hoping they might somehow bridge the growing chasm in their relationship. Jessica came down first, her blonde hair still damp from the shower, wearing the expensive business suit that Margaret's credit card had purchased. She barely glanced at the carefully prepared meal, instead grabbing her phone and scrolling through social media while picking at a single pancake. David followed shortly after, pecking Jessica on the cheek, but barely acknowledging his mother's presence. "The coffee's a bit bitter this morning, Margaret," Jessica commented without looking up from her phone. "Maybe you should invest in better beans instead of buying that cheap grocery store brand." Margaret bit back her response, knowing that the cheap coffee was actually an expensive organic blend she'd started buying specifically because Jessica had mentioned preferring it. Instead, she simply nodded and began clearing the dishes, a familiar ache settling in her chest. "Oh, and Margaret," Jessica continued, her tone carrying that familiar edge of condescension. "My mother is coming to visit next weekend. You'll need to make sure the guest room is spotless, and please try to keep your old lady smell contained to your own room. It's embarrassing when company comes over and the whole house reeks of mothballs and arthritis cream." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, but she maintained her composure, continuing to stack plates with hands that trembled slightly. David said nothing, didn't even look up from his own phone. The son who had once defended his mother against playground bullies now sat silent while his wife delivered crushing insults. "Actually," Jessica continued, warming to her theme, "I've been thinking we need to have a serious conversation about living arrangements. This whole situation isn't working anymore. You're constantly underfoot, always trying to insert yourself into our conversations and decisions. Honestly, Margaret, you've become such trash. No wonder nobody wants to be around you anymore. Maybe it's time you started looking into one of those senior communities where you'd fit in better with people your own age." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's hands stilled on the dishes, her breath catching in her throat. In all her years of teaching, dealing with difficult students, parents, and administrators, no one had ever spoken to her with such casual cruelty. The woman who had dedicated her life to nurturing and supporting others had just been dismissed as trash by someone living in her home, eating her food, and benefiting from her generosity. David finally looked up, but instead of defending his mother, he simply shrugged. "Jessica has a point, Mom. Maybe it would be better for everyone if you found somewhere else to live. We're adults now, and we need our space." Margaret set down the plates with deliberate care, her movements precise despite the earthquake happening. In her chest, she looked at her son, this man she'd raised with such love and sacrifice, and saw a stranger. The boy who had once promised to take care of his mother when she got old was now casually discarding her like yesterday's newspaper. "I see," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I understand perfectly." But what David and Jessica didn't understand was that Margaret Rose Williams, the woman who had commanded respect from thousands of students and parents, the principal who had never backed down from a challenge, was far from finished. They had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. That evening, after David and Jessica had left for their weekly dinner date at an expensive restaurant, paid for with the credit card Margaret provided, she sat alone in her living room, surrounded by the photos and memories of a lifetime spent giving. The house felt different now, charged with a new energy that Margaret hadn't experienced in years. It was the same feeling she'd had when facing down difficult school board members or confronting parents who refused to acknowledge their children's behavioral problems. It was the return of her backbone. Margaret walked through her home with new eyes, cataloging everything she saw. This wasn't just a house. It was her legacy, built through decades of hard work and careful financial management. Every piece of furniture told a story of sacrifice and planning. The mortgage had been paid off 15 years ago through her diligent extra payments. The renovated kitchen, the finished basement, the landscaped garden, all products of her labor and investment. She moved to her home office, the space that David had temporarily borrowed and never returned. Her important documents were still filed in the cabinet he'd pushed into the corner. The deed to the house, her retirement account, statements, her will, insurance policies, and investment records. Margaret had always been meticulous about her finances, a skill that had served her well as both an educator and a single mother. As she reviewed her financial position, Margaret realized something that David and Jessica had apparently forgotten. In their entitled assumptions, she was not some helpless elderly woman dependent on their charity. Her teacher's pension was substantial, her investments were sound, and her home was worth considerably more than when she'd purchased it 30 years ago. She had been supporting David and Jessica, not the other way around. The next morning, Margaret made several phone calls. The first was to her lawyer, Patricia Chen, whom she'd known since Patricia was a student in her advanced placement English class 15 years earlier. Patricia now ran a successful family law practice and had helped Margaret with the estate planning updates she'd made when David married Jessica. "Mrs. Williams," Patricia's voice was warm with genuine affection. "What can I do for you?" "Patricia, dear, I need to discuss some changes to my living situation. I believe I may need to evict some tenants." The second call was to her accountant, who had been managing her investments since her retirement. The third call was to her longtime friend Eleanor, a retired real estate agent who still kept her finger on the pulse of property values in their neighborhood. By the end of the day, Margaret had a clear picture of her options and the strength of her position. She also had something she hadn't possessed in months: a plan that would restore her dignity and teach some very important lessons about respect and gratitude. Margaret Rose Williams, the woman who had been called trash by someone, living off her generosity, was about to demonstrate exactly who held the power in this situation, and she was going to do it with the same quiet dignity and devastating effectiveness that had made her a legend in the education community for over 3 decades. Margaret chose Thursday morning for her decisive action. Trash day in their neighborhood, a detail that she found poetically appropriate given Jessica's cruel words. She had spent the week making careful preparations, consulting with her lawyer, and ensuring that every step she took would be legally sound and absolutely final. David and Jessica had left for work at their usual times, David heading to his accounting office downtown, and Jessica to her marketing job at a firm that, Margaret had recently discovered, she'd only obtained through a recommendation letter Margaret had written. The irony wasn't lost on her. At exactly 9 a.m., Margaret opened her front door to find Patricia Chen standing on the porch with 2 other individuals, a locksmith and a sheriff's deputy. Patricia held a folder containing legal documents that had been properly filed with the court the previous day. "Are you ready for this, Mrs. Williams?" Patricia asked gently. She had been shocked when Margaret had explained the situation, having known her former teacher as one of the most generous and kind-hearted people she'd ever met. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," Margaret replied, her voice steady and calm. The legal documents were straightforward. A formal eviction notice based on the fact that David and Jessica had been living in Margaret's home without a lease agreement, contributing minimally to household expenses, and had now been given proper legal notice to vacate the premises within 30 days. What made the situation particularly swift was that Margaret owned the house outright, and her tenants had no legal protections since they'd never formalized. their living arrangement. While the locksmith began changing the locks on all exterior doors, Margaret and Patricia methodically packed David and Jessica's belongings. Everything was boxed neatly and professionally. Margaret's teaching background had made her naturally organized, and she approached this task the same way she'd once prepared classroom materials. The scene was remarkably calm and orderly. Margaret had learned long ago that the most effective discipline was delivered without emotion, with clear consequences that spoke louder than angry words. Each item that went into the boxes was a reminder of how David and Jessica had taken her generosity for granted while treating her with increasing disrespect. At 4:30 p.m., just as the afternoon light was beginning to fade, David's car pulled into the driveway. Margaret watched from her living room window as her son and daughter-in-law approached the front door, their faces showing confusion when David's key wouldn't work in the lock. Margaret opened the door before they could knock, her expression serene and composed. "Hello, David. Jessica. Your belongings are on the front lawn, boxed and ready for transport." The shock on their faces was immediate and complete. Jessica's mouth fell open, while David stammered, "Mom, what is this? What's going on?" "This," Margaret said calmly, "is the consequence of calling someone trash in their own home while living off their generosity. You have 30 days to find alternative housing arrangements, as specified in the legal eviction notice you'll find taped to the top box." Jessica's shock quickly transformed into fury. "You can't do this. This is insane. David, tell your mother she can't throw us out." "Actually," Margaret replied, her principal's voice returning in full force, "I absolutely can. This is my house, which I own free and clear. You've been living here as guests, and guests who insult their host forfeit their welcome." David finally found his voice, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "Mom, you're being completely unreasonable. Jessica didn't mean what she said. You can't expect us to find a place in 30 days. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw not the grateful child she'd raised, but a man who had become comfortable taking advantage of others. "David, I gave you life, raised you alone after your father died, sacrificed my own dreams to fund your education and career, and opened my home to you when you claimed to need help. In return, your wife called me trash, and you sat silent. That tells me everything I need to know about the man you've become." The neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual scene of boxes on Margaret's typically pristine lawn. Margaret was acutely aware of the audience, but she felt no embarrassment, only the satisfaction of finally standing up for herself after years of being diminished in her own home. "Mrs. Williams," Jessica's voice took on a pleading tone as the reality of their situation began to sink in. "Please, we can work this out. I was having a bad morning when I said those things. I didn't mean it." Margaret's smile was gentle but implacable. "Jessica, dear, I spent 35 years teaching teenagers, and I learned to tell the difference between genuine remorse and panic at facing consequences. You meant every word you said, just as I mean every word I'm saying now. You called me trash on Tuesday. Today is Thursday. Trash day. How perfectly appropriate." The following weeks brought a parade of desperate phone calls, pleading text messages, and awkward encounters that only reinforced Margaret's conviction that she had made the right decision. David and Jessica had initially found temporary shelter with Jessica's parents, an arrangement that lasted exactly 5 days before Jessica's mother called Margaret personally. "Margaret, I need to apologize for my daughter's behavior. Linda." Morrison's voice was tight with embarrassment over the phone. "I had no idea how she'd been treating you. After 3 days of listening to her complain about everything from our guest towels to our coffee, I'm beginning to understand what you've been dealing with." The conversation revealed much about Jessica's character that Margaret had suspected, but never confirmed. Linda explained how Jessica had always been demanding and entitled, expecting others to cater to her needs while contributing little in return. She's 32 years old, Margaret, and this is the first time she's ever had to face real consequences for her behavior. Maybe this is exactly what she needs. David's attempts at reconciliation were perhaps even more painful to witness than Jessica's tantrums. He showed up at Margaret's door on a Saturday morning, looking haggard and desperate. Margaret invited him in for coffee, hoping against hope that her son might finally understand the magnitude of what had transpired. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything that happened," David began, sitting at the kitchen table where she'd served him thousands of meals over the years. "I know Jessica can be difficult sometimes, but family is supposed to forgive each other, right? Can't we just put this behind us?" Margaret studied her son's face, searching for any sign of genuine understanding or remorse. What she saw instead was calculation, the same expression he'd worn as a teenager when trying to talk his way out of punishment after breaking curfew. "David," she said quietly, "tell me what you think Jessica did wrong." He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, she shouldn't have called you what she called you. That was harsh. And what else?" I'm not sure what you mean." "What about the 2 years of living in my home without paying rent or utilities? What about the expensive meals I prepared that were criticized and taken for granted? What about the credit cards I provided that funded your lifestyle while my savings dwindled? What about your silence when your wife repeatedly disrespected me in my own home?" David's face reddened. "Mom, we never asked you to do those things. You offered." The response hit Margaret like a revelation. This wasn't about Jessica's one cruel comment. It was about years of entitlement and exploitation that had been masked as family obligation. Her son genuinely believed that her generosity had been freely given without expectation of basic respect or gratitude. "You're absolutely right, David," Margaret said, her voice deadly calm. "I did offer all those things, just as I'm now offering you the opportunity to learn how to stand on your own feet like the adult man I raised you to be." David's expression hardened. "Fine, if that's how you want it to be. But don't expect me to come crawling back when you change your mind. And don't expect us to take care of you when you're too old to manage on your own." Margaret smiled sadly. "Son, I've been taking care of myself just fine for 72 years. The question you should be asking is who's going to take care of you now that your safety net is gone." As David stormed out, slamming the door behind him, Margaret felt a complex mixture of grief and relief. She mourned the relationship they'd lost, but she refused to accept responsibility for its destruction. That burden belonged to the man who had allowed his wife to call his mother trash and had seen nothing wrong with the sentiment. The legal eviction proceeded without further incident. Margaret's lawyer reported that David and Jessica had found a small apartment across town, their lifestyle considerably scaled back from the comfortable arrangement they'd enjoyed in Margaret's spacious home. The expensive dinners, designer clothes, and casual spending sprees were no longer possible on their salaries alone. Through mutual friends, Margaret learned that the couple was struggling with the reality of independent adult life. Jessica had been forced to take a second job to help make ends meet, while David discovered that his business wasn't as self-sustaining as he'd believed. Many of his clients had come through Margaret's connections and referrals, resources that were no longer available to him. Margaret felt no satisfaction in their struggles, but she felt no guilt either. They were simply experiencing the natural consequences of their choices, the same lessons she'd tried to teach countless students over the years. Actions have consequences. Respect must be earned and maintained, and gratitude is not optional in healthy relationships. 6 months after Trash Day, Margaret's life had transformed in ways she never could have anticipated. The house that had felt like a prison of unappreciated service now breathed with new life and purpose. She'd redecorated David's old room into a proper home office, complete with a comfortable reading chair, and shelves lined with the books she'd never had time to enjoy during her working years. Margaret had also discovered something remarkable. She was not the lonely, unwanted old woman that Jessica's words had tried to make her believe. Once word spread through her network of former colleagues and friends about what had happened, Margaret found herself the center of a supportive community she hadn't realized existed. Eleanor, her real estate agent friend, had introduced her to a book club filled with retired professionals who gathered weekly to discuss literature and current events. Margaret's sharp mind and years of educational experience made her a valued member of the group, and she found herself looking forward to their Thursday evening meetings with anticipation she hadn't felt in years. She'd also begun volunteering at the local literacy center, tutoring adult learners who were working toward their GEDs. The work reminded her why she'd chosen education as her profession in the first place. The joy of watching someone's face light up when a difficult concept finally made sense, the satisfaction of helping people build confidence in their abilities, the meaningful contribution to her community. Margaret's financial situation had also improved dramatically without David and Jessica's expenses draining her resources. She'd been able to increase her charitable giving, take a long-postponed trip to visit her college roommate in Oregon, and even hire a housekeeper to help with the maintenance tasks that were becoming more challenging as she aged. The most unexpected development had been her friendship with Patricia Chen, her former student turned lawyer. Their professional relationship had evolved into a genuine personal connection, with Patricia often stopping by for Sunday afternoon tea and conversation. Margaret found herself mentoring the younger woman through career challenges and life decisions, a role that brought her tremendous satisfaction. "You know, Mrs. Williams," Patricia said during one of their visits, "I've been thinking about what happened with David and Jessica. As painful as it must have been, they actually did you a favor by showing their true colors so clearly." Margaret considered this observation while pouring tea from her best china service, the same set that Jessica had once criticized as old-fashioned. "You may be right, dear. Sometimes the most difficult experiences teach us the most important lessons." David had made a few attempts at contact over the months, usually around holidays or when he was facing particular challenges with his business. His messages were carefully crafted to sound conciliatory while avoiding any real acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Margaret had responded politely, but briefly, making it clear that superficial pleasantries could not repair the fundamental damage that had been done to their relationship. Jessica, meanwhile, had made no direct contact at all, though Margaret had heard through the community grapevine that she'd been complaining to anyone who would listen about Margaret's cruel and vindictive behavior. The irony was not lost on Margaret. The woman who had called her trash was now trying to portray herself as the victim of an unreasonable old lady. As Margaret sat in her peaceful living room on a quiet Sunday afternoon, surrounded by fresh flowers from her garden and the warm light streaming through windows that no longer looked out on resentment and ingratitude, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place. The woman who had once felt invisible and unwanted had reclaimed her dignity and discovered that she was far from powerless. She'd learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable destructive behavior. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to let them experience the consequences of their choices. And sometimes the people who call you trash are simply revealing the poverty of their own character. Margaret Rose Williams had spent her career teaching young people that respect is earned, not given, that actions have consequences, and that true strength comes from standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. At 72, she'd finally applied those lessons to her own life, and in doing so, had found not just peace, but a kind of freedom she'd never known existed. The story of Trash Day had become something of a legend among her friends and former colleagues, not as a tale of family dysfunction, but as an inspiring example of what can happen when someone decides that their dignity is worth more than keeping the peace. Margaret had become proof that it's never too late to reclaim your power, never too late to demand the respect you deserve, and never too late to discover that you are worth so much more than the way others choose to treat you. In the end, Jessica had been right about one thing. Margaret was like trash. She'd been discarded, dismissed, and treated as worthless. But what Jessica had failed to understand was that one person's trash can be another person's treasure, and Margaret had finally learned to treasure herself.